Steve meets with Mike again. Mike is still worried about Hartley's proposal and keeping his company, offering to sell Steve himself the patent and all the research on RD-4895, but Steve insists on selling his entire company to their client, convincing him that his company is the hottest military contract on the market, but subtly threatening to fire him before selling if he doesn't fall in line. James and Riley are using the plane hangar to plan their next move. James thinks grabbing Steve at his estate is impossible, so they should focus on doing the mission at Capstone, where they have a shot at taking him alive. They go to scope out Capstone when they spot the FBI agents. Tony and another agent, Mackenzie, go to speak with Steve directly about Gordonis, but Steve claims he was off the clock when he got killed. They ask him about his large security detail, wondering if he pissed off someone like James Reece, but Steve claims to not know the name. Mackenzie calls out his bullshit, having noticed his bone frog tattoo, which seals where to honor their fallen, but Steve reveals he is just an admirer and wears it in remembrance of his family that served. Tony warns that James is the real deal, but Steve blows them off, saying he has meetings. Katie gets a meeting with Mike and his lawyer, questioning him about his turn in vision from Alzheimer's research to military applications, calling it a cynical turn in his life's work, and this seems to get to Mike. He excuses himself to the bathroom, but Katie confronts him there. She asks him about RD-4895 and its effects on soldiers. Mike is taken aback, but he thinks RD-4895 has not reached humans until Katie suggests it could be the reason the SEALs never came back from Syria. Mike refuses to say, so Katie gives him her number for when he is ready to talk. She leaves and is being followed by a black van. James and Riley are back at the hangar going over the intel they've gathered. Riley thinks it's going to be a difficult grab, but James has questions that Steve will answer for him. She notices his shaking hand, but he claims to be fine. Katie is in an apartment when she gets a text from James warning her that FBI agents are on her tail. Steve, Mike, and the Capstone board meet with the client to finalize the sale. The client still has concerns about their contract with the Pentagon and wants to renegotiate with Steve, asking Mike to leave the room. Filled with resentment, he reaches out to Katie, and they plan to make contact that night. Steve then learns that Mike logged into the company server and suspects he is talking to the press. James is keeping an eye on Capstone when he sees Steve leave with his security detail, timing their movement. Tony is also nearby and notices a car from Steve's convoy not following, but decides to follow Horn. James also notices the car and decides to follow it instead. Katie and Mike meet at a transit station, where he explains that RD-4895 is a drug that was supposed to solve PTSD by stopping the encoding of traumatic memories in the brain. Horn froze their project after the animal testing phase. Outside, James watches a lone Talos security guard enter the transit station and prepares a gun. Mike hands Katie a thumb drive containing everything on RD-4895 and Nebelum's financial records when she notices the Talos guard, grabs Mike, and takes off running, but Mike is killed. The man chases after Katie, who puts distance between them before lying in wait and shooting him dead. Outside, another Talos guard approaches but is killed by James. The two stop in an alley, where Katie explains what RD-4895 is and how they rushed the drug to human trials and ended up giving the SEALs brain tumors. After the death of his team, Horn removed all 100 million of his shares in Nebelum and sent them to a bunch of shell companies, which James suspects was to pay for the ambush of his men. James demands the names of the companies. Katie wants time to produce her story, but he reminds her this is about his family. He takes Mike's thumb drive, warning her to leave the city or she will die. He then calls Ben, asking him to use his resources to uncover the names behind the shell companies. Richard returns to his office searching for his cell phone when Hartley walks in holding it, flanked by two DCS agents who uncovered payments from Steve to an account set up in his mother's name. He tries to make excuses, but Hartley plans to make an example out of him and send a message to Horn. Ben calls James with the names behind the companies, warning him that knowing this will change everything. Ben reveals Admiral Pillar, Captain Howard, and his commander Bill Cox were all involved. Hearing this, James decides to build an EFP and take out Steve. Riley tries to talk him out of it, as an EFP could kill civilians, but James knows what he is doing. James and Riley get to work creating their device, loading it into a van. The following day, James drives to Capstone, which is crawling with reporters and the FBI as news of Mike's death surfaces, and Tony suspects something is up. Riley warns James of the large crowd of civilians, but James thinks everything will work out fine. Soon, Steve and his bodyguards walk out and speak to reporters about Mike's death. Tony spots a suspicious van parked in traffic, and he and Mackenzie pull guns and push down on it, only to find a disguised Riley delivering flowers. Unaware James is in another van. James pulls up as Steve finishes his interview and primes the weapon. Katie then appears, confronting Steve, framing James for Mike's death. James is praying for her to move as Riley is forced to free up traffic. James cannot waste another second and exits the van, and just as Steve realizes what's happening, he sets off the EFP, destroying Steve's car. Katie is thrown to the ground, but alive. Steve survives the explosion with severe injuries and is freaking out, so James pulls his rifle and starts engaging the Talos mercenaries, taking them all down. One guard tries to escape with Steve, but James drops him with expert shots before putting 2 shots into a begging Steve's head. James steals a nearby van and takes off with FBI agents in pursuit. 2 weeks earlier, James had gone to visit Lauren's parents. They believe he is innocent, but James makes it clear that he will be seeking revenge, and they encourage him to do what he needs to. In the present, James is in a high-speed pursuit with Tony and Mackenzie on his tail. Riley wants to come get him, but James refuses to bring trouble to her. He manages to stay ahead until local PD hits the truck with spikes, causing him to crash. They spot his rifle moving and open fire on the truck, but James is already gone. James races up a mountain and breaks into a home after the occupants have left. He tunes into FBI channels on a walkie before treating a wound he received. His head starts to hurt, but he can do nothing as he left his pills inside the truck. On the radios, he hears the FBI K-9 team arrive, so he grabs what he can from the house before heading back out. Riley calls Ben, worried about James as he isn't himself, and there is a storm coming in, but Ben thinks it's good luck as the FBI will have a hard time tracking James. As for his mental state, James at 50 is better than most at 100, so he isn't worried about him. Meanwhile, Mackenzie is leading a tracking team when they come upon a disemboweled deer, which has thrown off their dogs. Reece is moving through the darkness, using only his eyes as his night vision begins to malfunction. When the storm hits, he shelters inside a cave. He looks over his list and uses his blood to cross out Steve's name, with only the admiral, captain, and commander's names left. The next day, the FBI's HRT team arrives, and Tony starts coordinating their approach to capture Reece. A few of the HRT guys are former SEALs and know how dangerous James is. Tony wants to tag along with them, giving them full permission to leave him behind if he slows them down. James is already moving when the HRT chopper circles overhead, and he hopes they're prepared to use all their training as he purposely activates his cell phone. The HRT team lands and begins tracking the cell signal, unknowingly walking right past James, who is hiding under dry grass. They gather around it, so James sets off a stun grenade along with smoke, incapacitates one of the men, takes his pack, and takes off. He begins dropping batteries to fake heat signatures, sending the team into a riverbed while he heads up a mountain. They get back on his trail and close the distance, and Tony calls out to James, ordering his surrender and offering him a chance to get some help. James ignores him and takes off once more, reaching the top of the hill but coming upon a cliff. James digs in and takes aim, picking up Tony on scope moving up the hill, but reminds himself he is dealing with agents. The HRT team gets to the top, but James is gone. Tony then spots a lone bullet sitting on a rock and learns it means James had a shot but decided not to take it. James is climbing along the face of the cliff, but it becomes too difficult and he loses his grip, falling hard onto a rock. That night, the rain returns, so the FBI calls off their search. James creates a makeshift tent. He searches the pack he stole only to find explosives and no med kit, so he uses a flare to heat a knife and cauterize his wound, then passes out. He dreams he is talking to Lauren on the baby monitor, and when he wakes, Tony is responding to him on the radio, telling him it will not end well. Tony knows he had a shot but didn't take it, indicating he isn't that far gone and can turn himself in now. After a long silence, James warns him to leave. Tony thinks it's time to put an end to this, but James wants the people who killed his family dead. Going to war was easy for him, but being a good dad and husband was way harder. He tried doing both until they took her from him. Tony wonders what his dad would say, but James tells him it's foolish to push a man to violence when violence is what he's dedicated his life to perfecting. The next day, the hunt continues. The FBI team comes upon where James was camped, and from his tracks they realize he may be hurt. The agents then deploy their own drone to get eyes on him before continuing on. James is walking when he has another hallucination, seeing Lucy. The sound of a drone interrupts this vision, and James shoots it down, but the FBI now has his position. He wants to get to a nearby river, but realizing the HRT team is too close behind, James lays charges in the dirt before sliding down the hill with the detonator. Mackenzie and her team come upon James, who threatens to detonate if they or the HRT behind them come any closer. He demands they leave, but Mackenzie aims her gun, threatening to shoot if he doesn't comply. James steadies his mind before detonating, causing a mudslide that scatters the team. James survives, but he sees Mackenzie's hand sticking out of the mud and decides to save her, performing life-saving CPR. Mackenzie wakes, and James disappears before the HRT can get there. Riley hears news about the mudslide and that James is suspected dead, but James walks in. The two take off, and Riley treats his wounds and gives him meds. Soon they get over the sea, and James jumps from the plane. He comes up on a beach where Ben is waiting for him. Pillar, Howard, and Cox meet in Pillar's office, scrambling to cover themselves in the event they are exposed. Howard thinks they should leave the country, but Pillar and Cox refuse, reminding him they are covered legally and James wouldn't be mad enough to show up at Naval Command. Meanwhile, James watches them leave the meeting from a boat. Ben notes that Cox and Howard are easier to get to than Pillar, who refuses to leave base. Ben suggests a sniper shot, but notes it would be too difficult and cannot risk a miss. Hartley watches video footage of Katie confronting Steve with the information on RD 4895. Later, she classifies James Reece as a domestic terrorist. Tony thinks their best chance of catching Reece is to find out who he is targeting next by finding any connection to Mike and Steve. Katie then turns up to talk. She wants to make a deal, information for help finding James. She tells them about the conspiracy to test RD 4895 on the SEALs and the companies associated with the Nibelum sale. She knows James needs to be stopped, but others need to be held accountable as well. Tony decides to work her lead, but refuses to let her leave custody. Pillar returns to his office to find Hartley there along with CIS agent Azad. She is curious as to why he sent an entire SEAL team on an operation with such weak intel, but Pillar defends his decision. She asks him who elevated the order, but Pillar refuses to say, so Hartley leaves with Azad, promising to keep in touch. Howard returns home to his family, nervously explaining they will be going on a trip right now and wants them to pack their bags, unaware Ben is listening in on his conversation. He returns to James, telling him about Howard's planned trip. James is worried about Ben getting in trouble for helping him, but Ben already has a plan to retire somewhere in Peru. James apologizes for pulling him into this, but Ben reminds him that they pulled him in when they killed his family. James has created an explosive vest with a plan on his mind. Tony and his team eventually find Pillar, Howard, and Cox's names linked to the companies, along with another company, Oberon Analytics. He then deploys his team to tail all three from War Command. Howard is packing with his family when there is a ring at the door, and it's Ben disguised as an FBI agent. Tony and his team then turn up at War Command with a search warrant. Pillar invites them in, claiming he has nothing to hide, then hands Tony a file, warning he has stepped into the wrong pile. Tony then learns that Howard is missing, and they are tracking Cox, who is sitting in a bar. He heads back to his car when James confronts him there. The two begin to fight, and James breaks Cox's arm before injecting him and knocking him out. James brings him into the sea, tying him to a log the SEALs use for training. James asks who else was involved, but Cox tells him it was just the three of them. Cox did this all for money, but James tells him he betrayed the Brotherhood before leaving him to hold the log on his own, and eventually he drowns there on the beach. It turns out James had Howard and his family watch all this go down. Howard begs for his life, asking him to consider his family, but James reminds him of his own. James wants him to do something, but Howard cannot bring himself to do it, so James starts dragging his son toward the sea until Howard tells him to stop. Howard then decides to go through with James's plan. He then tells Ben he is going home to see his family, and Ben realizes he is even further gone. Ben calls Katie, apologizing for hurting her. Tony goes through Pillar's file and sees evidence of his drug trials, and is confused as to why he handed it over. Just then, Azad and other CIS agents turn up, and Tony learns he is being pulled from the case. Azad reveals the RD 4895 experiment was not technically illegal, as Pillar had authorization from the Pentagon to make the decision. His boss then tells him to hand over everything on Pillar to CIS, and that he will be going on leave. Tony goes back to Katie, revealing the RD 4895 experiment was authorized by the Pentagon, and there is one last stakeholder they cannot unmask. He hands over Pillar's file, urging her to finish her story as soon as possible. Katie starts writing her story, where it is revealed Hartley authorized the RD 4895 experiment. She calls her editor, who offers to publish her story within the hour, so she sends it over. James is at home when he learns about Hartley's involvement. Meanwhile, Tony is keeping watch on his home. At that same time, Howard turns up at War Command and walks into Pillar's office, asking for the room. Pillar is concerned about the game Hartley is playing, but Howard's mind is somewhere else. His phone rings, and he hands it to Pillar. It's James, telling him there are 1,400 ball bearings pointed at his face, 100 for every seal. Howard then reveals his Claymore bomb vest, explaining he didn't have a choice. Pillar tries to beg for his life, promising to tell him who else was involved if he lives, but James already knows and detonates Howard's vest, killing them both. Tony learns that the bomb was remotely detonated and decides to move in on James. He spots movement inside and barges in, but James ambushes and disarms him. Tony explains that they have evidence on everyone involved and begs him to let justice take its course, but James tells him he is justice before knocking him out. Katie is still at the library when she learns that her editor did not receive her email. She becomes worried and is about to leave when Hartley walks in, informing her she wrote a great story, but she is wrong. She gives Katie the choice to leave or get the chance to interview her and learn the truth. Ben and James are tracking Hartley, who has now gotten herself Talos security. She knows he is coming, but it doesn't matter to James. Hartley brings Katie to her heavily guarded home on a private island to hold their interview. There, Hartley admits to all Katie's facts except she isn't the beneficiary of Oberon Analytics and never received a payout. She initiated the test, but had no part in the cover-up. She wanted to help military personnel from PTSD stress and its effects and had no idea about the tumors until she watched Katie confront Steve. Pillar initiated the operation in Syria to cover up the tumors and was paid by Steve to do so. Tony has identified Ben as James's accomplice. They know Hartley is setting a trap for James to come after her, but Tony isn't satisfied with things ending like that and plans to break orders and go after James, with the HRT willing to join him. Katie stays at Hartley's home, sending a text to James that she is prepared for him. Ben and James are on their way when they run into a police checkpoint.
I'm here, man.
One cop approaches the van and takes Ben's driver's license. The cop has his and Ben's wanted files but doesn't recognize him and asks to check the van. A female cop steps inside to check around. She comes close to James's hiding spot and Ben clutches his gun, but Ben's ID checks out and the female cop finds nothing off. Hartley and Katie continue their interview, where Katie accuses her of laying the blame on dead men, but Hartley stands by her word that she is innocent. Katie wonders if James will see it that way, but Hartley thinks he is just confused and hurting after losing his men and family, which is why she hired Talon to defend herself. James and Ben get to the boat left behind by a friend of James, where they find weapons. Meanwhile, Tony and Mackenzie meet the HRT team and also set off toward the island. Ben and James get to the island. Ben warns there are 15 Talons waiting for them outside and wants to go in with him, but James wants him on the boat operating the .50 caliber. Ben tries to talk him out of it, telling him they could leave for Peru now, but James has to see things through. Katie is packed to leave, handing Hartley her edited story. She, however, wants to clarify one last thing. Katie starts questioning her about the timeline of events, only to realize Hartley knew about the issues with RD 4895, was aware of Pillar's plan, and did nothing to save them to cover herself. Hartley admits this, saying it was a sacrifice she was willing to make to save countless lives. She, however, refuses to let Katie leave with that story, but as a Talon mercenary enters the room, Ben and James launch their attack. As Ben covers him with a machine gun, James starts moving through the compound, engaging and taking out the men. The HRT team lands, and Ben calls for James to abort. The HRT team then begins to take fire until Mackenzie calls out that they are fed. James makes it into the home. Using smoke as cover, he begins engaging the men inside. Meanwhile, Katie and Hartley are inside her safe room, and she sends her last 2 guards out to kill James. James finishes off the men in the corridor. He is tackled by another and takes a round, but kills the man with an axe. The last guard stands down, and James has him open Hartley's safe room before killing him. James then enters. Katie begs him to stop, explaining that Oberon Analytics is someone in the CIA. James's injury starts acting up, and Katie tries talking him out, explaining she has everything on tape. James doesn't care and aims his gun, but Hartley ends herself. The HRT team gets to the safe room to find Hartley and Katie. Tony is outside when he sees James limping away and confronts him, demanding he surrender. James ignores him and prepares to swim away. Tony prepares to shoot until he learns that Hartley took her own life and lets him go. 3 weeks later, James reaches out to Katie, who has found out Oberon is routing through a bank in Peru. Ben is on his boat in Peru when James appears there. Turns out Oberon Analytics was Ben, who fed the bad intel that set up his team. Ben admits that he knew from Pillar that James had tumors and wanted them to die with dignity, but partly he did it for the money. He, however, tearfully denies having anything to do with Lauren and Lucy's death and helped James seek vengeance as a part of his repentance. Ben is ready to meet his end, and with tears in his eyes, James kills Ben. In the end, James looks over Lucy's drawing before letting it go in the wind and setting sail for Mozambique. Thanks for watching. If you had a good time, go ahead and hit that like button, drop a comment, and of course, subscribe for more recaps just like this. And hey, don't click away just yet. YouTube thinks you'll love one of these 2 videos popping up right here, so check them out next.